So my name is Andrews. I hope everybody can hear and see me. I'll be taking this workshop on regional political organizations or regional political bodies. And mainly I'll be talking about their frameworks, their general goals, and also I'll speak a bit on about 4 specific regional bodies that I've targeted that I think mostly come up in debates. And so you end up needing these informations about them in a very, in much more frequency than you do about other regional bodies that exist. That being said, I'm going to go through the outline for the workshop, and then we should be able to begin. So the outline is I'm going to be introducing myself. I'm not sure if everybody here knows me, so I'll just do a quick introduction of myself. Run a very template disclaimer, which everybody needs to know. Then we'll delve into the proper workshop, which is to talk about an introduction to regional political bodies. And then we'll mainly talk about the African Union, the European Union, the Association of Southeast Asian States, and then we'll talk about the Eurasian Economic Union. And then when we are done, we'll have a Q&A session. Now, after I talk about each of these stages, would also be open for questions in case people have intermittent questions to ask in that regard. Yeah, so I think we can start now. With a quick introduction of myself, my name is Terkpertey Andrews Terku from the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, a Ghanaian, and I've been debating since 2018 January. So I was introduced to debate in January 2018, and that's about 5 years back. But yeah, most of the substantial growth I've experienced in debating have come in very recent years as well. I'm a fan of debating more than judging. Let me say speaking more than judging. But in recent times, I've also been judging a lot, way more than I thought I ever would. And so yeah, you would see me speaking in most competitions, but you also see me judging some, and also serving on CAP for some other competitions. Personally, debating is my hobby because I think I like talking a lot and I like arguing. And so that's it. I think this should do with a brief introduction for myself, and we can go ahead with the disclaimers. Just a couple of things to note here is that, first of all, this workshop doesn't promise to be every single detail you know or you need to know about these regional bodies. What it seeks to do is to give you a smooth entry into the subject area such that you are easily able to learn further from here and understand it in a much more debate-specific context. Secondly, I would also like to note that the information that will be heard through this workshop are obviously not ones that I came up with myself. There's research that I did. I consulted other sources and other resources that exist, some pre-existing debate and resources. And so what it means is that whatever I share here is really not a personal construction, but more of information gathered, hence credit to all the sources I referenced, which I mainly can quote because there are a lot in most instances. But finally, also note that at some point in time within the workshop, I'll be sharing personal perspectives on issues, and I'll flag as and when I'm going to share personal perspectives on issues and how you can make use of them in debates. What that means is that in those instances, you do not take them as facts or as absolute truths, but rather as what they are, which are my personal perspectives, and you may apply them in whichever way form you wish. Okay, I hope we are all clear now. That should do. If you have any question, you can post them in the chat space. I'll be paying attention to the chat space from time to time, and hopefully that should. Quickly, let's start. First thing is to introduce ourselves to what regional political organizations are. I think the term regional there already insinuates that there are other forms of political organizations. There are probably three other categories that you can name, mainly international organizations, which are global in nature. For instance, the United Nations, the World Health Organization, which cover majority of the countries that exist in the world. You can have sub-regional organizations like the ECOWAS, which even though it's in Africa, only covers West African states, right? And then you can also have national political bodies, which are the political institutions that we find in various countries and various nations. That being said, regional political bodies are also part of the stratification of the political bodies that you have. But most of the time, these political organizations are on a regional basis. So we have the African region, we have the Asian region, we have the European region, right? And so these are various regions that exist. Now you have political bodies that specifically deal with some of the issues and some of the concerns that arise within those unique regions. What it means is that for those regional bodies, they really do not concern themselves with the matters outside their region. They are usually concerned with matters inside their region, and they stick to that. Comparing regional bodies to global international bodies, some of the things to note here is that, of course, they are smaller than global international bodies. So the UN would obviously have a larger constitution in terms of number of states that sign up to the UN compared to, for instance, the European Union, because the European Union is only limited to Europe and countries within Europe, as opposed to the UN being expanded to every single country in the world. What it also means is that they are more specific in nature because, like I said earlier, they concentrate on issues that are specific to those regions. In some instances, this specificity helps them in maximizing their efficiency to dealing with most of those issues. So unlike, for instance, the United Nations, which would be concerned about the Ukraine conflict, but also be concerned about the conflict in Ethiopia, the regional body, for instance, the African Union, would only be concerned about the conflict in Ethiopia and not be so much concerned about the conflict in Europe, right, or in Ukraine. And so they are probably much more specific, much more detailed, and much more efficient. I think the efficiency is debatable, which we'll come to look at, and are much more, they are defining factors that affect the efficiency in very distinct ways, and we'll discuss them as time goes on. But thirdly, they are less Eurocentric and Western dominated. So regional political bodies, unlike global political bodies, don't have the tag of Eurocentrism. Mainly, one of the biggest critiques we see in debates concerning global political bodies is to say, well, these global political bodies, you have only the biggest countries and the most powerful countries in the world dictating the things that go on there. So for instance, when you go to the UN, you obviously have the Security Council made up of US, Russia, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, right? Dictating what goes on there because they have the veto power to pull off decisions that are made by the United Nations. Unlike the critiques that happen on the global front, regional political bodies usually are insulated from the critiques of Eurocentrism, Western dominance, and appear to be much more representative and much more dependent of the influence of most of the powerful states. And so, like the European Union, the African Union, let me use the African Union as specific. When Africa goes to the UN, there are lots of concerns about the extent of influence that Africa has and the extent of regard that is given to the views of the African continent. But when you come to issues of the African Union, of course, there is an understanding that there is much more representation of the African issues and African perspective because, of course, their sole purpose is to represent the African continent. Given this, I think it speaks about the more representation that exists and less oppression that exists as well, given that they are viewed to be less Eurocentric. But also they are viewed to be much more trustworthy. trustworthy not in terms of efficiency per se, but trustworthy in terms of ill incentives, right, or ill motivations. Because when there's a debate about the UN stepping in to help in most instances, or any other global international organization helping in African countries or in some other countries, there is always a debate about whether or not the incentives of the actors involved can be trusted, because sometimes they tend to exploit the people that they seem to be helping. I think most of the instances, these concerns are reduced when it comes to issues of regional political bodies, because it is less concerning if the AU wants to intervene in conflicts that are happening within the African continent, because it is intuitively assumed that the AU has much more incentives to do good by Africa as opposed to other political entities, especially on the global front. But one other distinct critique that comes is the less capacity, especially for political bodies that are in regions with less power. So, for instance, of course, when you go to the European Economic Union, because they are already powerful countries that by default or by geographical allocation fall under Europe, hence find themselves in the European Union, they are probably going to be much more powerful and won't have the issue of capacity being less. But if you come to the African Union, given that most countries in Africa have less economic power, less military power, less global influence, it means that the AU itself tends to find itself in positions where most of the time it lacks the power to, or it lacks the capacity to efficiently deal with most of the problems that arise. So the whole point is that given that regional political bodies are right from the start set up to be much more specific and smaller in nature, or very centered on a specific group of people, it insulates itself from most of the critiques that come from global political bodies. The reason why this distinction is crucial is because I think there are some debates where instead of you being forced to simply say, for instance, if they say the UN should intervene in a particular country, or the UN Security Council should intervene in a particular country, instead of you being forced to simply defend the alternative that says the country should do it on their own, you could pick a strategic alternative that defends why a regional body that has the capacity, or that particular country finds itself within, would be better positioned to deal with that issue and would insulate most of the critiques, most of the issues of mistrust that comes, right? And so I think that strategic positioning of regional political bodies really help them in their functioning as well. Let's move on to the next slide. In this instance, I think there are certain general goals of regional political bodies. I want to note here that not all regional political bodies have all of these goals. I think some of them end up choosing and picking which one they think they can focus on best and eventually deal with them. So some of these goals, some of regional bodies can be set up for political integration, which means that they are mainly for political purposes and making political decisions and determining the political stance of the region on global issues, or also on internal matters as well. Some of them are for economic integration and economic unions, right? So the European Union has a leading role in this. Aside the fact that it's a politically integrated system, it's also popularly known for its Eurozone, which is the economic integration aspect of the European Union, which makes them use one currency, which is the euro, and eventually they have a much more integrated trading system. The other reason why these bodies can be formed is for conflict resolution and the maintenance of peace, right? And so I think there are some instances where countries face conflicts and you need an external arbiter to deal with the conflict or serve as a neutral entity to resolve that conflict. And so regional political bodies are able to position themselves better because most of the time because the persons who lead these bodies are persons from the region, they much more understand the history, the culture, the context within which these conflicts are happening. And so they are able to mediate it in a much more reasonable way compared to if you have a far-off external entity coming to do this. The other reason is for crisis management, things like water crisis, health crisis. I think in the wake of COVID, we saw various regional bodies stepping up to initiate various health protocols, but also put in place various resources that could help smaller countries within their region deal with most of these issues. What you need to note here is that most of these goals that I'm identifying are also goals that can be applied to global political bodies. And that's just something you should keep in mind. And so most of the time when there's a debate comparing regional political bodies versus global political bodies, the nuances really boil down to efficacy, capacity, interest, and good faith, and the ability to execute these things in a much more profitable way. Final thing is also on global political influence. For instance, the European Union is globally influential because after their political coalition and their economic coalition, they are able to leverage on that collective capacity that they have to make global demands or to position themselves in a much more strategic way. So for instance, the EU, given its market size and its market value, can make very strategic market demands that other people will still have no choice than to comply with, unlike individual countries making those demands, given that if you're an individual country and you're doing that, they can simply choose an alternative. But if it's a regional bloc and they still need access to that region, they have no alternative than to comply with the demands of the region. And so most of the time, it's also an avenue to mobilize and create much more strategic political influence in the global sphere. So these are the reasons. I think generally when there are debates about regional political bodies, it would boil down to 1, 2, or 3 of these reasons in general. And the thing is that you need to be able to identify which of these reasons is most important for the regional political body that is being discussed in that debate. Hence, you are able to streamline your cases or your arguments or your discussion to that regard. Before I move on to talk about the specific ones that we have, like the African Union and the European Union, etc. Any question up to this point? If there are no questions, I'm just going to wait for about 30 seconds. If there is a question, you can either raise your hand in the Zoom or you could just indicate in the chat space if you have a question. Okay, I assume there are no questions then. So let's go. Let's start with the African Union. Great. The African Union was originally formed in 1963. It started as the Organization of African Unity, so what we know as the OAU, right? Now, at the time, they had just 32 independent states, and they had a couple of aims, but one distinguishing factor about the African Union at the time, which is to note, is that it wasn't progressive as it is now, because back then, issues of women empowerment, issues of gender-based violence, gender equality, etc., were not really paramount, and so they weren't really fused into the aims of the AU. But mainly, the construction of the OAU was to solidify the African continent such that they tend to be viewed as one big people and to cooperate and to achieve unity and peace. Note that this was from a period where Africa had suffered from colonization and colonialism. And so one of the mobilizing pillars was for Africa to unite in a way that preemptively builds capacity to deal with any form of future invasion that's likely to come, right? I think the main setback for which reason that construction of their Organization of African Unity failed was that they had a very unique policy that said if countries were in conflict or in instances where countries were having trouble, the OAU would not interfere. So they had a non-interference clause where the African Union never interfered in any internal affairs of any country. What it meant was if Madagascar was oppressing its people, the AU or the OAU at the time had zero legitimacy to comment on the issue, to speak about it. It was one of the reasons why tensions brewed over and over again in the African continent, and the OAU was seen to be defunct because it had no capacity to deal with most of the core issues that were happening within states and between states. And so it made the OAU to be seen as, what do you call it, an ineffective institution, and it didn't really have any form of influence, and it became defunct. Now, in 1999, the likes of Gaddafi and leaders that were mainly Gaddafi to see, started pushing for the rejuvenation of the African Union, or of a union of such sort, because the idea was that he eventually wanted to spearhead an African continent that would challenge the West and also challenge other global institutions. So fast forward in 2002, the AU was formally re-established, and that's what we know has existed till now, which is the African Union. Now, it is the union or the regional political body with the largest member constitution. So it has 55 countries. It has a larger constitution more than the European Union, right? Now, most of the aims of the African Union were similar to the aims of the Organization of African Unity, just that it beefed up its aims to reflect development in all sectors like science and technology, healthcare, startups, etc., and drive most of its goals, expand its goals to encompass the 21st century ideas of what is important and what the world needs to thrive. But also it included women empowerment and most of the social issues that became prominent. But more importantly, this version of the African Union now changed from being from non-interference to non-indifference, right? The key distinction here is non-indifference placed a preemptive obligation on the African Union, not just to create conditions that prevent states from oppressing each other internally, their members, but was also obliged to interfere when states are doing this, right? So there's also some form of conversation about whether or not the switch from non-interference to non-indifference was a good thing for the African Union, but currently that's the way in which the African Union works. And it's also in furtherance of one of its pillars of peace and unity in the vast majority of instances. But here is something interesting I found when I was researching this. I think that the African Union is way more complex than lots of us see it to be, right? So the African Union has a whole list of divisions and sectors. It has the assembly, right, that has all member states where they put most of the general issues to the floor for voting. They have the executive council, they have the Pan-African Parliament, which is a parliament where all member states have representations that speak on issues and make legislative decisions. They have the Commission of the African Union, the Economic, Social, and Cultural Council that's supposed to be specifically interested in developing economically progressive models that are applicable to the African continent, that are likely going to enhance the economic conditions of the African continent or position Africa to be a strategically appealing continent in terms of its economic value, right? But also to deal with the cultural nuances and how Africa can integrate on the AU without having cultural complications. But more importantly, the African Union also has financial institutions that are under its umbrella. Three main financial institutions. The first one is the African Central Bank that the AU uses to front its projects and to finance its projects. You have the African Monetary Fund that has been established to replicate the structure of the International Monetary Fund, which is the IMF, such that countries can go to it and obviously receive financial aids as opposed to going to the IMF, and the African Investment Bank that also spearhead most investments within Africa. In 2020, when the pandemic hit, the AU established the African Medical Supplies Platform, right? And by 2023, Africa is also spearheaded towards the Africa Economic Community, which is the AFCTA, right? The Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. I think the AU in this description is much more complex than most of us view it. And the reason why understanding the different parts of the AU is crucial is because most of the time when there are debates happening and the AU is required to take an action, people view the AU as a unilateral entity without understanding its compartments to be able to utilize why there is a specific compartment in the AU that's dedicated to this, and so would have a much more sophisticated understanding or would have much more appreciation of the issues that's going on. And so, for instance, if there's economic conditions going on and you say the AU should take an action, I think being able to identify that there is a stratification within the AU that is specifically responsible for economic issues, but also that the AU has financial institutions that they are able to make use of to spearhead their projects, sort of gives you a strategic framing advantage compared to a team that only speaks about the AU in a unilateral term or in a unilateral sense, right? If you're able to identify that the AU has a security institution that spearheads AU peace mission, peace missions, right, or peace mission efforts, I think it gives you a better strategic position to explain why the AU is a better actor in dealing with conflicts internally, as opposed to referring to maybe the Security Council of the UN or maybe NATO or any other alternative that exists. So I think the key thing here, specifically about the African Union, is that in as much as it is seen largely as being defunct, which is the critique that most people will give to it, given that it was reconstituted within this century, which is not long ago, in 2002, it needs probably more time to develop, and a way in which you can defend the prospects of the African Union is to explain how it is constructed in a way that when you grow it, it's likely going to be multifaceted and very functional in dealing with most of the complexities that arise in the African continent, right? Before I move on, before I take your question, which is in the chat, let me just round up with the African Union. There are other things then that you need to note about the African Union. There are tensions within the African Union, right? Like most regional organizations, there are at least critiques and tensions here and there. The problem is that, for instance, Libya wanted to host the AU Parliament, right? But the concern with Libya hosting the AU Parliament, and remember, I said Gaddafi was the strongest leader that was pushing for the AU's rejuvenation in 1999. The critique that came with Libya hosting the AU Parliament is Libya itself wasn't a democracy. Libya itself didn't have a parliament. And so it seemed a bit counterintuitive to allow a country of such stature to now hold the parliament of the regional body on the continent. And so it became a dicey situation. And then they couldn't allow Libya to hold the parliament. For that reason, there is some form of pre-established, dislike between most of Libya and most Libyan leaders and also the African Union in a way that makes Libya act much more aggressively and averse towards issues of in the African Union. But eventually, Ethiopia was selected to be the AU and the host of the AU Parliament. and before it was moved to South Africa. But of course, I think we know that Ethiopia has the AU headquarters as it stands now. Now, members of the AU Parliament are designated by their countries, right, or by leaders of their countries. And the goal of that AU Parliament, and this is very crucial, as it stands now, the AU Parliament is not fully a parliament with legislative power in Africa. What it simply does now is to oversee budgets and perform much more of a ceremonial role. But the goal, which when I'm explaining the EU, I'll talk about the similarities between the AU and the EU and why most people feel the AU is modeling its structure after the EU. But the goal of the AU Parliament is to establish a system where individual countries, just like they vote for their presidents, would truly vote for their AU parliamentarians in a way that allows those parliamentarians to have full-fledged legislative power extrapolated from their citizens, and so they can make legitimate legislative rulings, right? In that way, that parliament would be able to function as a full legislative body that would pass laws that would be binding on states, that would pass policies that would be binding on member states in a much more strict way compared to the way in which they operate now. The final thing that you need to probably note about the AU, if you want an introduction to it, is that, as you would know, like I said, most countries in Africa find themselves in an economically weak position and also in a geopolitically weak position because they are less influential on the global stage. What it meant was that even when the African Union was created, even though most countries had the will, they didn't have the capacity to fund most activities of the African Union. And so the construction of the AU headquarters, for instance, was funded by China. China has also been seen to fund other major projects of the African Union, right? And so there's also a question about the extent of influence that China has in the African Union and why the AU is probably going to become a puppet of Africa. There is a whole perspective of debate there. And this probably becomes more concerning if you put it into the perspective that, given the Belt and Road Initiative of China, China is also expanding its loaning systems into Africa and becoming a fast-growing alternative for African countries. And so given the likeness that's been developed for China within most African countries, there is also a question about the extent of influence that China has in the African Union. I'm not sure there's any concrete proof to it. Maybe it's simply finding agreement, but yeah, I think it's a valuable information that will help you in a debate one day or another. All right, that being said, I think that's mainly the things you need to know under the African Union. Let me take the question in the chat space before we move on. The question says, is the stance of non-indifference applicable to issues outside Africa too? No, that stance is not applicable to issues outside Africa. And that's why the African Union can declare to be neutral in issues of Israel versus Palestine, right? And mainly because, like I said, regional bodies are more focused internally within the region as opposed to externally within the region. And even when they want to have external regional influence, usually that influence comes only by building their internal regional influence to a very appreciable extent. So I hope that answers your question. In the next 30 seconds, if you have any other questions about the African Union, this is the time to ask. If not, we would shift to the European Union. Any questions? Okay. I assume there are no questions, so we can go to the European Union. Now, the African Union is pretty similar to the European Union in lots of ways. I'm going to be explaining that very soon. And maybe that would also help defending the African Union if you have found yourself in a debate. And the reason why I'm sort of stressing on strategies that you can use to defend the African Union is because in most debates, it's very easy to discredit the African Union. Very, very easy to discredit the African Union because of stereotypes that exist, because of the less vibrant nature of the union in recent years. We've seen very less of its actions and its activities, and people are also less informed about the extent to which the AU is functional, right? And most people don't know the AU has peacekeeping forces. Most people don't know the AU has economic divisions. Most people don't know the AU has financial institutions that have financial policies or financial offers that are supposed to help smaller states. Most people don't know this, and so it becomes very easy to um, uh, oppose the existence or be in opposition to the African Union and its activities. All right, let's talk about the European Union. Unlike the African Union with 55 countries, the European Union has 28 countries and it was formed in 1993, right? So one of the key things here is to say, people usually say that the African Union has the potential to become the most powerful regional body in the world, because if you look at the European Union being made up of 28 countries and how powerful they are, if Africa is supposed to construct itself properly, it's probably going to be super, super powerful. But the point here is that the AU also has a slightly similar structure to that of the African Union. And it's sometimes confusing. You have the AU Council, you have the AU Commission, you have the AU Parliament, you have the Eurozone, the Court of Justice, and then you have the human rights, the AU, the European Human Rights Court also. So the AU has lots of divisions which perform different functions, right? If you look at the council, for instance, it is made up of leaders of each member state, right? So they are like a board of directors, sort of. But the point is that the council simply just determines the overall direction of the European Union. So they determine which treaties are relevant and should be signed, which new members do they recommend to join the EU, and they also dictate reforms, right? Like EU appointments, they set the agenda for the EU for every year. And so they have more of a supervisory role in the way in which they function within the EU. If you come to the EU Parliament, right, or the EU Commission, the Commission has a college of commissioners. So as the Council determines the overall agenda, the Commission has a much more functional role or a much more deeper role. So it's responsible for areas of policy, trade, energy. So every country has an EU commissioner, right? Now these commissioners serve on the EU Commission. So maybe the commissioner for Turkey doubles as the commissioner for energy on the EU, right? That's the system within which it works. So every country commissioner that has works on the EU has a distinct sector that they focus on. Now, what it means is that the Commission has a much more functional role and not a supervisory one. And so they draft things like international laws, implement the laws that come within the countries, or they represent the EU's interest in foreign deals and foreign negotiations, and they manage the EU's finances, right? So they also have a huge say in budgetary approval, the extent to which budgets are allocated, etc. So for instance, when the council dictates that this year they want to maybe have COVID relief, given that there is COVID that exists, the AU Commission is now able to determine budgetary allocations and much more policy specific, legislations that are able to spearhead the efforts towards achieving the goals that the council sets for them, right? Then you have the EU Parliament. Again, the EU Parliament has a representative from every other state, right? So now you have 751 members in the EU Parliament, okay? Now, the 751 members in the EU Parliament, there is an interesting way by which the members, because you note that they have just 28 countries, but they have 751 parliamentarians. Now, these parliamentarians are located proportional to your population. So if you're a country with higher population, you end up having higher parliamentary representatives. If you're a country with a smaller population, you end up having smaller, parliamentary representations. right? Now, these members are directly elected by citizens. So in most EU countries, and that's why I said the African Union probably wants to emulate the EU. In most EU countries, they hold elections for EU parliamentarians, right? Such that citizens vote and select who becomes their EU parliamentarian, and eventually that person goes ahead to represent. So that's what they do, and that gives the EU Parliament more substantial legislative power because they're able to pass legislations that affect national legislations and that countries tend to pass, right? Now let's talk about the European Council or the Council of the European Union. Now it's more of, what do you call it? The council, like I said, more of plays a supervisory role. But also, the council is crucial in this instance because individual country leaders, presidents, are represented on the council, right? So the reason why this is crucial is because even though the sub aspects of the EU, of the council, like the commission, like the parliament, seem to have much more substantial power and influence, most of the things that they do are directed and tailored or put into perspective by the council and the determinations of the council. One interesting thing here is that the EU Commission and the EU Parliament most of the time have to agree on issues before they are implemented or passed. And that's an internal check mechanism that the EU uses a lot. And so if you have the EU Commission pushing for something, the EU Parliament have to concur before they can go ahead and then implement them. It's also vice versa. What that means is that there's much more coordination and extra steps taken to ensure that all countries are satisfied. So you have a country commissioner that's satisfied, and you have country parliamentarians that are satisfied as well before any determination on the EU or on substantial policies within the EU are made. Then you have the Eurozone, which is what most of us know the European Union for, right? The Eurozone, which is the economic zone that the EU has created. And so most EU members, by membership, are part of the Eurozone. You have special trading relationships with other EU countries, and it makes internal trading easier. But also you are forced to use the same currency, right? So that's European integration in most instances. Now, it's the most tangible representation of the European integration, like I was saying, because of course the EU Parliament and other aspects are much more superficial, but the Eurozone is much more integrated in that regard. What that also helps is that it helps smaller countries in terms of currency, because given that big economic powerhouses and their economic activities give the euro a very strong valuation on the global scale, smaller countries that tend to use it also benefit from that currency value. I mean, there are debates about whether or not high currency value for smaller countries or underperforming economies is a good thing, but yeah, generally, I think people tend to credit that for it. Then you have the European courts, right? Now, the European courts that you have has one judge from every country. Okay, so there is one judge from every country on the European court. Again, I'm pointing out these things because you have various claims in various debates that the EU is, there is a bullying system within the EU where big countries like Germany and France are the ones dictating what the EU does, and there's little to no influence by smaller countries. There are lots of influence by smaller countries. Based on geography and the way in which parliamentarians are distributed, but also there is a veto system within the EU where EU commissioners can veto, and if there is no 100% vote or unanimous vote, that doesn't pass, right? And so you realize that smaller countries can make use of this as a means of objecting to policies that would directly hurt them. Okay. Now, with the Eurozone, for instance, Bulgaria and Croatia are in final stages of joining the EU and adopting the Eurozone. Most all other countries in the EU are part of the Eurozone. Bulgaria and Croatia are in their final stages of doing that Kosovo and Montenegro also use the euro, even though they are not part of the EU. I think these examples, somebody is unmuted on the call. Can you please mute yourself? Okay, sure. That helps. The reason why Kosovo and Montenegro using the euro outside of the European Union and outside of the EU is a very valuable example here, is because most of the time when people are debating whether or not countries should join the EU, one key advantage of it is to say you need to access the economic benefits of the European Union. And a much more effective way to discount that, especially if you have other reasons why they shouldn't join, which are not economic, you could say they could try and secure strategic deals with the EU such that they could have very unique trading relationships with the EU, access the Eurozone, and also use the euro, even though they are not part of the European Union. Case in point, Kosovo and Montenegro, and the way in which they interact with the European Union. Right? So I think those two examples are very, very valuable to keep. Now, also, all aspiring members of the European Union are legally obliged to adopt the euro. So if you want to join the European Union, it's a legal obligation that you adopt and use the euro. You cannot be part of the European Union and not use the euro. The only two countries that were exceptions to that is the United Kingdom and Denmark. Now, these two countries had opt-outs and the ability not to use the euro, even though they were part of the European Union. And UK is, just to flag this, is no more part of the EU, right? And that's that. But I think this makes an interesting opening for you to go and read on, probably to understand how countries could exist in the European Union and not be using the euro, such that you could use those reasons to make cases in the future. You could also read on why Kosovo and Montenegro are outside the European Union, but can also use the euro as a currency, which helps them trade much more fluidly with the European Union and countries within the Eurozone. Just like, or similar to the African Union, the EU also has financial institutions. So you have the European Central Bank, and then you have the European Court of Auditors, right? Now, the Court of Auditors audits financial statements, financial dealings of the EU and make sure that their books are clean. But the European Central Bank then has a very huge financial role in major countries within Europe, because they are the major financial backbone of European countries and European markets, right? So, any question up to this point about how the European Union operates, right? Just to flag this here, that the EU Court, right, or the European Court of Justice, serves as a supreme court to all courts within various EU countries, right? So EU law is viewed as law for all countries. And in instances where a national law conflicts with an EU law, states have to go to the EU court to settle it and to resolve those conflicting legal provisions, right? But the EU court is very, very powerful. So the EU court can make a pronouncement that individual state courts has to oblige and have to oblige by them, and then that influences the extent to which they are controlled within that instance. And so if you would realize, probably the most important differentiation between the EU and the African Union is not really about the structure and the composition, but about the extent of influence and how deep-rooted the EU institutions have become in the affairs of member states, hence are able to exert more control and more political power among member states in that regard, right? So here's the thing. Given all these characterizations, you realize that the EU is closer to becoming a country, because the EU has a parliament that's very powerful. It has a court, a Supreme Court that's very powerful. It has a commission. It has a council that's made up of leaders of all states, etc. But there are a few things that the EU doesn't do, hence it doesn't make them a country, right? The EU has no common budget, and so individual states are able to make their budgets on their own. The EU cannot levy taxes, so individual states tax on their own, except in instances where those taxes conflict with EU economic provisions, right? There's no treasurer for the EU. There's member states are also largely sovereign, even though that is very debatable as to the extent of sovereignty that member states has. But yeah, I think member states are largely sovereign in that regard. And there is no standing army for the EU as well. So these are reasons why in some instances the EU is probably less powerful than a state. The reason why these distinctions are crucial is because most of the time people want to use the EU as a model to explain when they want to make, for instance, if you want to defend the creation of the United States of Africa, right? People usually want to see it would be similar and powerful as the EU is, or they try to use the US as an example. Let me not talk about the US, but some people want to drift towards the EU because they think it's less controversial. But I think there are some distinctions that would differ when the EU starts to operate as the country of Europe as opposed to the way in which it's operating now, and that makes it strategically different and hence a very important distinction to note. Any question about how the EU operates and the influence of the EU or the value of the EU? I think if you want to look at how applicable this is in most debates, the EU debates that come up is mainly many EU debates boil down to how smaller states within the EU benefit. Let me just put it that way, because most debates end up becoming a battle of how smaller states within the EU benefit, or unless the debate is also about expanding the EU, and it then talks about why the EU's existence and why the EU shouldn't expand and some of the benefits or harms of it, etc. But strategically, I think there are ways to deal with the issue of exploitation within the EU. The first thing is that individual states reserve certain amount of power to dictate for themselves and to carve their own path. So for instance, individual smaller states have control over their own national budgets, they have control over their national military, they have majority of say over their national economic policies, and most of the time they also have veto powers. They also are given some amount of veto power within the EU to object to various things. And so when countries don't do this, it is making it difficult to believe that they are being exploited. It makes it difficult to believe that they are being bullied. Most of the time, it's probably because countries buy into the things, just that they don't go as planned, right? So I think there are ways in which you can mitigate this. But just to flag that the EU also is limited in the extent of power that it has. And so big states really don't bully small states the way in which people characterize them. Just that, yes, because of maybe the geographical distribution within the parliamentary system, maybe big states would end up having more parliamentarians, and maybe that's where their strategic political advantages come in that you can characterize. But it's not as if it's a rubber stamp system where small states have zero influence and zero say in the extent to which the EU affairs happen. Any questions up to this point? But yeah, the critiques of the EU are also the things that I just spoke about how exploitative it is, how it oppresses smaller countries. And another bigger critique is the economic integration that exists within the EU means that one country's economy fails, another country would suffer, like what happened in Greece and how you would pay the consequences or something of that sort. I think there's a fair claim there that if the economies are integrated and there's economic shock in one country, other countries are able to suffer that shock. But there's also the counter claim that if that country facing the economic shock is found within the EU or within an economic zone, it means that they are likely going to feel the consequences of the shock way less than they would have otherwise felt. So it means that on the minority side of these countries that are facing economic shock, it's probably better for them. And there's also an incentive for smaller or for bigger countries to help them out of that economic situation, given that the bigger countries now have a direct incentive to elevate those countries from those economic conditions that they are experiencing. And so I hope this helps, or I hope this also creates a much more complex understanding of the EU. But again, the EU debates also fall in the same trap as the AU debates. People view the EU as a unilateral institution, that anytime there's a debate about the EU, well, the EU economics, the EU should pass an economic policy. Everybody starts debating the economics of the EU. Meanwhile, you forget that for that to become an economic policy, the council, which is made up of all presidents of countries within the EU, should agree. The commission, which is made up of EU commissioners appointed by their presidents, should also agree, and they have certain veto powers in that aspect of the EU. You've forgotten that the EU Parliament, which has representations from all other countries that are directly voted by their people and are proportionally distributed based on population, also exists, and they have a say. And both the Commission and the Parliament has to agree before whichever institution is in charge has to take charge and then execute that policy. And so when you look at the hierarchy of the EU and you understand that there are stages that it has to go through, you can sometimes strategically make use of these pieces of information to explain why the EU cannot be overly exploitative, why maybe a certain policy would not be favorable or would not pass as opposed to another one. And you can probably have a much more comprehensive debate about the way in which the EU functions, as opposed to simply debating the EU in a very unilateral perspective, right? I hope this helps as well. Then we can move on to the next one. I think the next two shouldn't be as long as the EU and the EU. So let's look at the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which is ASEAN. This is less popular, but very, very important in the debating sphere, because conversations about Asia and the Asian region, the Asian continent, has become very, very prominent in the debating space. I would like to say there was an era where Africa was the major discussion in global debate. I think this is the era where Asia is also the pillar of global debate, especially in terms of IR. And so it's very crucial, about some of the what do you call it? The regional bodies that exist in Asia, right? So this regional group is made up of 10 countries. It was formed in 1976, and it was formed as a response to the rise of communism or communism insurgencies, right, in the region. Because around that time, the ideals of communism were spreading and insurgencies were springing up against communists. And so people were skeptical. States decided to come together to preemptively position themselves against such rise, right? Generally, they are open to more states, but just like the African Union or similar to the African Union, they grew very dormant, and then they had to revive them in 1976, right? Now, the way in which they work or their current structure is such that they have a council of ministers, right? But the ASEAN has a very specific objective. It is more economic oriented, and in that economic orientation, always wants to maintain peace, right? Because they believe that peace is the main driver of economic success. Okay, so the Council of Ministers that ASEAN has is mainly to settle disputes, okay, not to interfere, not to punish, not to be brutal, and not to be harsh, but mainly just to settle disputes among states, right? So that's mainly what they did and what they decided to do back then, and the foundation on which ASEAN was built. Now, there are some very promising statistics about ASEAN, because according to the World Bank, the cumulative GDP of Asian states grew from 91.1 billion to about 211 billion or 212 billion, right? in a few years. And that's crucial because countries that join ASEAN are now seen to be improving economically. And so it's one of the very, very important characterizations of the ASEAN that makes it attractive. But also, like I said, its main aim is for security and economic growth. But in recent times, there's been certain critiques about a policy about ASEAN, because ASEAN also has the non-interference ideas and non-interference agreement, just like the AU had back then, that says that they don't interfere in internal country matters. And so if you remember the issues of Myanmar that came and the ethnic cleansing that came up in Myanmar, and issues of Rohingya Muslims, etc., the ASEAN couldn't really take a very strong stance on the issues because their policy within the union itself bars them and limits significantly the extent to which they can maintain internal peace. And that again begs a question as to whether maintaining non-interference as a clause in ASEAN is in conflict with its goal of maintaining absolute security and peace to drive economic success. Because if you can't interfere in internal matters, and those internal matters are destabilizing peace within the region, they are likely going to distort economic activities, and that means that it's going to likely create much more complications for ASEAN, right? But there are general characteristics that make ASEAN enticing. For instance, they eliminate all internal tariffs and there is no common external tariff. This makes it very, very important. Even though they eliminate all internal tariffs, which means that among or within ASEAN, countries can trade and import and export freely without any financial tariffs that limit them. They don't act in that same solid way on the external front, right? So on the external front, an Asian country can decide to levy 7% tariffs on Ghanaian goods. Another Asian country can decide to leverage 2% tariffs on those same Ghanaian goods. What it means is that they are still then allowed to strategically weaponize their unique political affiliations to countries outside ASEAN in a way that helps them boost their own interests without being forced into a position where they have to sacrifice their interests in favor of ASEAN in a way. And that makes it a very, very relaxing principle that ASEAN is able to go by and makes it easier for countries to exist within ASEAN, right? And so in 2007, they signed the ASEAN Charter to create a single market for the region's 650 million people. Of course, that market is going to be very, very appealing and very, very enticing. In fact, that's one of the biggest markets in competition with the economic zone that the African Union wants to create with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, right? But the critiques of ASEAN is, like I said, because of its non-interference clause, it is viewed as relatively toothless to affirm the due to due to its policy of non-interference. And so it doesn't get involved in the internal affairs of member states. And so, for instance, in cases of genocide against Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, ASEAN can't do anything. And people heavily backlash ASEAN because they think they are very influential. And given how economically successful ASEAN has been, people view ASEAN as one of the most influential bodies that can punish a state in a way that would make them do the right things. Because if you are cut out of ASEAN and you start to face all the tariffs, you start to lose all the economic benefits, given how economically successful ASEAN has been, there is this belief that ASEAN can be very, very strong in deterring states from doing the wrong stuff, right? For instance, there are military coups that happen and ASEAN is not able to do anything. And so, given the critiques and the heightened tensions that happened, there was a landmark decision by ASEAN last year, 2001, yes, last year, that changes the scope to which you tend to view ASEAN and creates a much more conflicting discussion about whether ASEAN intends to maintain its non-interference policy or maybe would rethink it and revise the policy to become non-indifference like the African Union. Because in 2021, in the wake of the issues of Rohingya Muslims, what do you call it? Ethnic annihilation, etc., ASEAN decided to, for the first time, disinvite Myanmar from its annual meeting and its annual conference, right? And because they don't meet a lot, they meet just once for an annual conference, and they have strategic discussions for the incoming year. Being disinvited for that meeting sends a very strong message, right? Because ASEAN, like we said, have for a long time been non-interfering with lots of issues that go on within states. And so people are asking whether that's the first step to ASEAN revising its non-interference policy and probably becoming more strong in the way in which they deal with states. Again, that's a question that begs to be answered. And that's also up for debate as to whether ASEAN should revise its non-interference policy and become non-indifferent, or they should maintain it given the successes that they've had by maintaining that non-indifference policy, right? So yes, ASEAN is also rising up to become a strong institution, but also serves as competition to other what do you call it, superpower influences such as US's influence, Chinese influence in the Asian region, etc. Any question up to this point? Any question up to this point before I wrap up with Asian? If there are no questions, we'll just move on from there. Yeah, sorry guys. Someone just tried calling, so my network pulled off a bit. But yeah, like I was saying, ASEAN doesn't have legal powers, unlike the EU that has a court, that has a parliament that make rules that are binding across member states. But ASEAN has political weight in terms of the political signaling that they have, given how economically successful they've been over the years. And also because it has a track record of maintaining peace among its member states for a very, very long time. Because like I said, the ASEAN is set up to settle conflicts within member states, which has successfully done that, but also improve the economic prospects and economic conditions within those particular states. If there are no questions, then we can go to the final one, which is the Eurasian Economic Union. Right. Now, this is probably, I think, the most interesting regional political body that's upcoming. But also, this is probably the newest regional political body in town. Let me put it that way. Because the Eurasian Economic Union is being spearheaded by Russia, right? Now, this is more of in response to the collapse of the Soviet Union and Putin's attempt. And if you want to understand the sources and the history behind the formation of the Eurasian Economic Union, you probably want to study the man who is leading it, which is Putin, and Russia as a whole playing the major role in the Eurasian Economic Union. Because Putin described the fall of the USSR as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe in the 20th century. And so most political analysts view his attempts to create the Eurasian Economic Union as an attempt to reconstruct the USSR. I'm not sure how true that is, and that's why I said most political analysts. I'm not sure how true that is. I would just think in this instance that it is probably a theory that can be explored, but I'm not sure if that is the real reason. But yeah, the Eurasian Economic Union is spearheaded by Russia, and like indicated, it was launched in 2014, right? But what is interesting here for me is how countries that are part of the Eurasian Economic Union were made to join, because currently there are 5 countries that are in the Eurasian Economic Union. So you have Russia, you have Kazakhstan, you have Belarus, you have Kyrgyzstan, and then you have Armenia, right? These are the 5 countries that are part of the Eurasian Economic Union. The problem then is that unlike other regional bodies where you know that countries willingly join, there is a whole controversy about how countries decided to join the Eurasian Economic Union. And that's why it's here about how countries join. I'm probably going to take you through a few of them. And the reason why I think that context is crucial is because when you have debates about the Eurasian Economic Union, you are now able to understand the reasons why countries joined, and that would inform your decision on how they are likely going to behave and interact with various decisions that the Eurasian Economic Union is going to make. Let's take, for instance, Armenia, right? Armenia, just like Ukraine, had intentions of joining the European Union. In fact, in 2003, Armenian leadership was on the verge of signing to join the EU and signing agreements with the EU that would make them join the EU, right? Sorry, that would make them join the EU. The problem then is that Russia then started funding, what do you call it? Azerbaijan, right? Because there is a popular conflict, a very long-standing historical conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Now, Russia started heavily funding Azerbaijan with billions of dollars worth of military-grade weapons that were tipping the scales in favor of Azerbaijan in the conflict that was being fought. And so for Armenia to tip the scales back to their favor, to make Russia prioritize supporting Armenia over supporting Azerbaijan, they then had to sign up for the Eurasian Economic Union. And so you realize that most of the time, and which is the trend I'm going to be showing, countries that joined the Eurasian Economic Union were actually joining under some form of coercive factor, and because of the way in which Putin wanted to establish the system. What this meant was that Armenia really didn't have a choice as to whether to join or not, because it was more of a military strategic decision that they took. If you look at Kazakhstan, right? Kazakhstan is probably the most stubborn state right now when it comes to the way in which the Eurasian Union is formed. Because similar to Ukraine, Kazakhstan is stubborn because they have alternatives to Russia. Currently, Kazakhstan's main trading partner is China. Because they are closer to China geographically, they had much more trade and stronger trading ties with China, right? And what that meant was that Russia didn't have much to offer strategically. And so even though Kazakhstan is part of the Eurasian Economic Union, they're able to stand up to various things that Russia sees, because they can simply point out to an alternative, which is China, that they would easily offer their markets to, right? But one significant role that Kazakhstan has played in slowing down the rate at which Russia wants to rapidly solidify its hold in East Asia, East Europe, is because Russia, in the creation of the Eurasian Economic Union, wanted to model after the EU and create the Eurasian Parliament, and also create the Eurasian Army, and integrate most political systems for countries that will be joining the Eurasian Economic Union. The problem then is that Kazakhstan is saying that they won't settle for anything beyond economic integration. So they are not settling for anything about Eurasian Parliament that creates political integration. They are not settling for anything about Eurasian army that creates military integration. And so that has become a huge stumbling block to the creation and to the functionality of the Eurasian Economic Union, and also to the extent to which Russia is influential. And that makes it very, very difficult for Russia to expand and entrench the hold of the Eurasian Economic Union in a way in which they strategically want to do. But if you look at Belarus, Belarus is mainly a country that becomes like re-exporters of Chinese goods, right? And given that Russia and countries within Eastern Europe were the closest countries that they used to join, that are to them that they used to ship off their goods to, at the beginning of the Eurasian Economic Union, what Russia did was to create a customs union, which meant that countries that were not part of that customs union were going to sort of face things like tariffs and much more complications, selling goods and exporting goods or importing goods to those particular areas. What Belarus then had to do as a strategic position was to simply join the customs union and hence lead up to them joining the Eurasian Economic Union, because without it, they are a heavily exporting country which is dependent on re-exporting Chinese products, couldn't access Russian market, which is obviously the biggest market within that region, and in terms of Russia's population, etc. Right? But finally, with Kyrgyzstan was simply bought into it with money because Kyrgyzstan has been poor for a while, and Russia promised them more money, but also cheaper supply of energy and gas and natural resources, etc. So most of the countries that are in the Eurasian Economic Union have varying reasons why they are there. Armenia is there because Russia would supply it weapons. Russia will supply them weapons instead of Azerbaijan, so that they can deal with Azerbaijan in a much more sophisticated way. Belarus is there because they need access to the customs union so that they can re-export Chinese goods. Kyrgyzstan is there because they need cheap fuel and money from Russia. And Kazakhstan is there simply there because they want to explore alternatives to China and not because they are being bullied, etc. And so it makes it, what is strategically creating a problem then is that it's making it difficult for you to find a single goal for the Eurasian Economic Union, given that individual countries in there have 5 different goals. Russia's own is very obvious because they want to entrench their hold, they want to stand up to the EU and also to NATO and to US influence, and want to position themselves as much more influential within global affairs. But the thing is that the strategy that Russia used in Armenia probably didn't work in Ukraine, and that's why we have, to some extent, the Ukraine conflict that we have now. Because similar to what happened in Ukraine was that the Ukrainian president in 2013, which is Yanukovych, was a pro-Ukrainian president, right? Pro-Russian president, because at the time, there was actually a debate in Ukraine about whether to be pro-Russia or pro-EU. That president, Yanukovych, was a pro-Russian president, and so abandoned a deal that was set to happen between Ukraine and EU to favor the signing of Ukraine to join the Eurasian Economic Union. And that erupted several protests in the country, and eventually Yanukovych had to flee to Russia. It was after that flee that Russia invaded Crimea, right, as a response, sort of. And funny enough, it was a few months after that invasion that Armenia joined. And so it was more of a message being sent out to other former Soviet states or former USSR states that it's either you join the Eurasian Economic Union or you are likely going to end up in the same hot waters as Ukraine. And those tensions with Ukraine has built up to the way in which we see it today in Europe. But the point is that the way in which the Eurasian Economic Union is constructed means that there is no single goal, but also means that it's a much more of a Russian show, which means if something happens to the Russian economy, the Eurasian Economic Union is actually going down, because most of the countries in there aside Russia are not really economically powerful, aside Kazakhstan, that is much more economically free and independent, right? But currently, there have been no major strides and no major successes of the Eurasian Economic Union, aside the fact that, for instance, migrant workers in Russia from these countries that are from the Eurasian Economic Union are being treated like citizens. So they've cut red tapes for them, and they've also streamlined clothing exports from Kyrgyzstan. That gives them much more access to the Eurasian Economic Union's market. They've also spawned banana export industry in Belarus, and so they are trying and starting to pick up various economic activities and economic initiatives. In the long term, they look to be much more strong and much more heavily invested. And I think probably sanctions on Russia and in recent time have also limited the extent to which or the rate at which the union can grow, right? But eventually, also given that they started not long ago, just in 2014 when it was launched, it makes it more and more difficult to critique the lack of strength within the Eurasian Economic Union in the vast majority of instances. The way in which this strategically plays out in debates is that most of the time when there's debate about Russia, I think that, and the way in which there's debate about Russia and the way in which Russia behaves in Europe, I think when you put the Eurasian Economic Union into perspective as one of the main goals of Russia, you can then explain why they would take certain actions and not take certain actions, right? Secondly, there have been some debates about, given that Putin's influence internally is dipping, Putin should focus on internal politics or regional dominance as opposed to global dominance, right? I think when you understand the way in which the Eurasian Economic Union is playing out, you can also have nuanced perspectives as to how Putin should probably position himself, what should be his goals, etc. And so these are more of four major regional political bodies that try to cut across the various continents that we have. I think there are way more that you can talk about, way more that you can read on, but I hope this information helps because I think understanding the way in which individual regional political bodies are constructed help you distinguish how unique they are and how different they respond to different conditions, so that you don't view them in much more unilateral ways that make debates, in quotes, boring for you guys most of the time. All right. I think that should be it. The next thing to go now is question and answer session. So are there any questions for me? If you have a question, you can just raise your hand in the Zoom. And if not, you can indicate in the chat space, and then we could take it from here. I'll just hold on for a while and see if I have any questions in the chat space. I think I say this a lot. My teacher used to say this way back in primary school, that if you finish a teaching session and people don't ask questions, it's one out of two reasons. Either because you are a very good teacher and so everybody understands what you taught, or you are an extremely bad teacher and so nobody understands what you taught, and so they don't even want to ask questions and get further confused. I would hope that I'm the good teacher who taught in a way that everybody understood, and so everybody has no questions to ask. Okay, that being said, I would like to say a very big thank you to Debate 404, Debating 404, for putting this workshop together. It's been a pleasure being here and sharing the little I know on regional political bodies. I hope the nuances that have been expressed within this workshop are helpful in subsequent debates for everyone here. And I hope we all enjoy the rest of our evening as well. So thank you all for tuning in, and